Hi, everybody. Hello. So, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon. Since we have people from different time zones, so that's why I'm saying everything. Welcome to our project launch today on the issues of digital contact tracing in Southeast Asia. And it's so exciting to see all of you here. And this is actually our first big project that we have launched since the organization was founded 2 years ago, a year ago in 2019. Um, we have over 100 people register. I don't know how many of them will show up. My name is Floyd. You might recognize me from the banner or any other things that I've done. And nice to meet you here. I'm the founder of Digital Reach, and at our organization, we look at the impact of technology on human rights in this region of Southeast Asia on issues with freedom of expression, privacy, and digital security. Have to say that 2020 is crazy, and the COVID-19 was unexpected. Following the pandemic, digital contact tracing was introduced for the first time, starting in one place and spread out to other countries as a hype, with the belief that it would help put the pandemic in control. We have monitored and analyzed the situation in the region for several months, following the public concerns on privacy. And this topic is so new, not much information is available, but it's important to look at it. So this is why the project was born. The event today is divided into three parts. First, the introduction and the launch, in which I'll talk more about the project in a bit and show you the finding. Second is the fireside chat, and we have two experts with us today, whom I will introduce later. This will be followed by 30 minutes Q&A, and you are welcome to post your question in the Q&A box. If you would like to ask if you have a specific question regarding the panelists, so please post their name. So yes, let's start. Let me introduce you to the project. No. Sorry. I can't seem to share the screen, so wait a minute. Okay, now it works. So when you visit digitalread.asia, you scroll down and you see the map. So when you click export, actually this map, if you actually click on this black circle here, you will be directed to the country chapter. And when you click explore, it will be the introduction. With the map reappear again on the right. We call this project the pandemic of surveillance due to the flaw that we have found from the adoption of digital contact tracing in the region. This flaw opened opportunity for the collected data to be misused and exploited, unfortunately. Apart from the public health purpose. So in the introduction, you see the objective, you see the methodology and limitation. We have monitored the situation from the beginning since March, but it took several months for us to put everything into a picture. as the situation develop. The narrative have developed really fast, and this is why we don't actually make a project in the form of PDF version, because the information can get outdated pretty fast. We gather information firsthand, as well as using the secondary resources. If you actually like visit the country chapter and also some of the regional chapter, you see that we use the references throughout the content. And we have a technical consultant to look at the release code at the technical part, while I work on the project as a researcher, in which the situation is analyzed based on the human rights perspective. We base our analysis on international standards like the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights Article 12, which talk about the right to privacy, and also the WHO, World Health Organization, international standard on how to use the proximity contact tracing app. Limitation that we have is that when we talk about app, when we talk about platform, we talk about device, sometimes it's like a moving target. Things get developed really fast, and we just don't have team of technical people to examine the app. And it would actually be interesting if we have like someone, like a team of technical people to do like full-time reverse engineering as the app like develop. But it would take a lot of time, it would take a lot of resources to do that as well, because the situation changes pretty fast, and reverse engineering can be complicated, and it's actually time consuming as well. So we didn't do that. So at the bottom, you see the regional overview, and if you click learn more, you'll be directed to the regional overview. So this will tell you about the regional pictures of the digital contact tracing in Southeast Asia. Here's the table for you telling like, okay, in 6 countries that have developed digital contact tracing, what apps and platform or devices they have, whether they open source or not, and whether like the policy, the privacy policy are in place, and tell you the common characteristic and also like other stuff in the regional overview. So we can go back here, map. So if you actually, this is great. If you actually click on the dot, you'll be directed to each country chapter. So here, this is an example of Singapore. See the Merlion and the Garden by the Bay. So when you visit the page, you see the timeline. So we put it all together since the very beginning, since Singapore came up with Trace Together. So going down to the very recent situation we have, and then you see the key finding. After that, later, the content is divided into 3 parts: the development of digital contact tracing in that country, which actually explain the timeline in more details. And the second session is the implication of surveillance and the right to privacy. And the last one is the conclusion and recommendation. So play with it if you have time, and read it if you have time. We will also update the timeline and the content as the situation develops. The whole thing can act like a database as well of digital contact tracing in the region of Southeast Asia. And for those who are interested to keep track on the situation. So next we will go to the finding. This is actually the heart of the event today. So this is, okay. Sorry, the technical things always a hiccup. So this is, so I'm showing you first for those who are not might not be familiar with the contact tracing apps in this region yet. So this is the name of it, and also the note telling you like what kind of technology, what kind of contact tracing there are. So in this region, there are two main approaches of contact tracing, which are the contact tracing app that use Bluetooth Low Energy, the BLE or the QR code. BLE is the proximity contact tracing approach in which an installed device would communicate with other installed devices within its certain range. Each device has an ID after an installation of the app, and this ID is used in order to indicate who is who. Where the collected info collected end up, it depends on which kind of protocol the app use, whether it's centralized or decentralized. The centralized approach would have the info collected stored in a place where it's accessible by usually authority or the developer, while the decentralization approach is considered as safer because you have more control over your privacy. As people have more control over the data. The decentralized protocol, like some of you who might be familiar with digital contact tracing might know about the DP33. And that kind of decentralized protocol, it would have the info stored in the device of the data or in the device of the data owner instead. And regarding the QR code, it is an approach used when people enter premises like building, shop, restaurant, office, and school, for example. It usually provides information on how many people have entered this place, at this time, on which date. Some QR code app and system is built as an extension of the main contact tracing app itself. We noticed that digital contact tracing app and platform in the region were usually built in a fast pace, like within weeks, and roll out without any assessment on human rights and privacy. Many of them don't have privacy policy in places as well. And interestingly, sometimes you are able to click on what it appears as the privacy policy in the Google App Store, in the App Store, in Google Play Store. But then it directs you to something else like the developer general privacy policy or the government agency general privacy policy. In this case, it's not a specific privacy policy of the app itself. Some of them do have one. Very few have launched it at the same time with the app, like Singapore. Some were added later after months that the app became public. So the common characteristic that we found is that there are three main common characteristics. After monitoring for several months, we realized that there are three main ones. First, technical functions that do not support privacy. Second, lack of transparency. And third, lack of policy enforcement. So the first one, technical vulnerability. Let's look at the first element. It means that the app or the platform itself doesn't support privacy. All of them tend to store the information in a centralized database where it is able to be accessed by the authority. It's quite hard to trust them in this case, given the political environment in many of the countries in the region that are under repressive regime. Doing it this way has also posed a risk for a data breach incident as well. And there have been cases occurred in the past before about data breach in the hand of the government, like got breached, and many times that the incident wasn't investigated thoroughly, or that the government didn't take any responsibility about it. And as a result, the incident was forgotten as the time went by. And actually, we have seen an example about a data breach incident already in Indonesia. And the data is allegedly the data collected from Peduli Lindungi, the country contact tracing app. As a result, the government denied that the data is from the app, but there has never been any kind of like a thorough investigation of the incident that is known to the public to confirm the government claim. The next thing is about the ID. So there are actually like two characters that we have observed in the ID used in the contact tracing app in this region: temporary ID and fixed ID. The temporary ID is the one that is changed after a period of time, which is relatively better in terms of privacy compared to the fixed ID, which is actually quite easy to identify the person's real world identity. The fixed ID was earlier used in the Vietnam contact tracing app called Blue Zone. But it changed later. This function is changed later after the second wave of the pandemic in Vietnam. It doesn't mean that the temporary, however, it doesn't mean that the temporary ID is 100% safe, as it also depends on the way this ID are generated. This is a bit technical, but let me try my best to explain for general audience. This is actually the case of Singapore Trace Together. If the ID is generated from the server in which the government is in charge of that server, they can also know the real identity of user. And this way, the data would be safe from hacker, snooper, and other user, but it won't be safe from the government themselves. And it's because the government can retrieve user data logs, decrypt and read them. So that's why it's not really safe. The way to fix it is to have the ID being generated locally by the app itself, not from the server. Because this way, no one except the user, like the owner of the data, would know the identity. And they actually have to provide informed consent to the server by sharing the list of that temporary ID for private data to be used first. Next issues is the location tracking. And anyway, the Philippines staysafe.ph has the function as an option in which user can choose to opt in. You might wonder, like, so if it's optional, it should be fine, but we should have kept in mind that if like the privacy first contact tracing app wouldn't include this kind of function at all, so in the first place. And in Malaysia, we found that one of the apps that is now no longer available, Gerak Malaysia, which was dismissed last July, actually used location tracking as well, despite being developed by the government agency itself. It wasn't approved by some other government agency in the first place due to this function. However, it was rolled out to public without any information known publicly on how the app was able to overcome the problem. Yeah, which is sadly. So next is the lack of transparency. So lack of transparency is a major issue that found in all digital contact tracing in this region. All the countries have issue with transparency with the digital contact tracing effort. The main issues is about the software being open source. Singapore Trace Together, Vietnam Blue Zone, and Thailand Moshana are the proximity contact tracing app that have released the source code of the app. However, even though they are considered as open source, there are also some issues with them. And let me explain briefly first about how an open source software works, since we have like diverse group of audiences here. The logic of an open source software is that people can comment on the source code in order to help improve the app to work better in terms of security and privacy, for example. However, the open source software seen in the contact tracing doesn't seem to work that way. So the code of OpenTrace, Singapore. So OpenTrace is like an open source source code of the protocol that Trace Together is built upon. Yeah, on GitHub, it hasn't been updated since the second version. From the first version in which Trace Together encountered a problem as the app cannot work in the background of an iOS device, the app has been significantly changed in the second version. This includes asking for more personal data, including an identification number. The release code is also not the actual code, but a reference implementation or the sample code of the software. Regarding Vietnam, following the second wave of the pandemic in the country started in Da Nang, the app has been significantly changed as well. And the developer actually released a white paper saying how it works. However, an independent source did reverse engineering it and found out that there's some code that hasn't been released, which allowed the developer collected contact history of user. Any user in general without that permission. We'll share the link. We'll share the link later, and you can try looking at it to confirm if you're good at reverse engineering. We can share with you the GitHub page later. The app also used fixed ID in the earlier version and changed to the temporary ID in the later version. So, however, it's not known here how the change is made securely. In terms of Thailand, we cannot find the code is released under any open source license. That's one interesting thing that we found as well. The app and the platform for contact tracing themselves are not that flexible. As a government project, it doesn't mean like if it doesn't meet the government interest and specification, those comments from technical experts in order for the app to be improved in terms of like security and privacy likely will not be considered. In fact, it would make it hard for the app and platform to follow the logic of an open source software as well. And this means that what we believe that if the app is open source, so that means it's safer, it's trustable, as been reviewed by the pool of technical expert. In this case, it seems like it's not applicable. Some of the countries like Indonesia and the Philippines chose not to release the source code of the app at all. Like in Malaysia, the government said that they would release it. Like you can see from the slide that he's actually the minister who's in charge of the app. So he talked about that on Twitter, like since April, since like in the middle of April. But the app in Malaysia, MyTrace, has never been open source from what we know. And as a result, apart from the information that are usually from the government or the developer of these apps that are not open source, we don't know how much, how they really work. How the personal data is kept and proceeded and other things, and it's harder for people to examine the software as well. Anyway, regarding the QR code, as I said, that's like it's actually like another main functions of the app. Regarding the QR code scanning approach, all of the software that involved with QR code scanning for contact tracing in this region is not open source at all. It cannot be proven how they work and proceed with data and security. All of the information available is mainly from, basically from the government or the developer. So next element, last element actually, lack of policy enforcement. So all of the existing law on personal data in the region, we have it in Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and upcoming one in Thailand, are unlikely to be able to protect personal data of people. Government are usually excluded from this kind of law, and when digital contact tracing app platforms are government project, the law usually doesn't apply in this case. Singapore has a new law about personal data protection, specifically on public agency, but we still have to see how this is going to work out. Malaysia, the law doesn't include both the federal and the state government. In Thailand, when the app was first rolled out, the government said that the personal data protection law would apply to the contact tracing app in the country. But, well, the law was actually passed in 2019 and was originally given 1 year before it became effective. But when that time arrived, which was May 2020, the law got postponed. In terms of the Philippines is actually pretty interesting. The law on the personal data protection is considered relatively better compared to other countries in the region. However, it is found that the app, SafeSafe.ph, was launched before the commission was done with the privacy assessment. And the app itself also suspiciously linked to some intelligence and national security agency. In terms of Vietnam and Indonesia, they don't have a law on personal data protection at all. Indonesia is the only country actually that issue law allowing health surveillance before launching a contact tracing app to the Lindungi. It's still questionable actually whether the law are constitutional due to the country constitution has a provision that is related to the right to privacy. Okay, so the thing is, they don't have any like independent oversight board or any oversight committee in most of the country that have developed the approach of the digital contact tracing. So it actually very poorly regulated here in this case. We noticed that the interesting pattern about the adoption of digital contact tracing in this region, like the more approaches introduced, the higher attempts to include more and more people in the digital contact tracing scheme in this region. The proximity contact tracing app doesn't seem to get people participated that much, as it's not mandatory in the first place. And there are also some limitation as well, like it works on the more recent version of the mobile phones only. And we know that it's not like, it's not like everybody can afford that. And then the QR code scanning approach was born, and people cannot avoid using it because they would be refused to let into places like schools, office, where they have to go every day. And at the end of it, they have to give in because they have no choice. Some country in the region like Singapore and Thailand started with a proximity contact tracing app, then later introduced the QR code scanning approach. Other countries have also used QR code scanning as well, along with other approaches as Malaysia and the Philippines. Indonesia also has a plan to develop the QR code scanning approach as well, following the next year budget approval of the ministry in charge, from what we know. Singapore is actually unique because it has moved on to invent their very own contact tracing device, get rid of all the limitation of Trace Together app found in the device. So Trace Together token, together with the app, became the Trace Together program with its very own device, and the fact that the program will become mandatory soon in December. It has overcome significant limitation found in the use of proximity contact tracing, and are likely able to include groups that might not have the kind of device in hand, such as senior citizen, underprivileged migrant worker, or children. Yeah, so that's the trend that we found. In terms of the regional stakeholder like ASEAN response, have to say that ASEAN has failed in terms of response to effect of human rights as a result of digital contact tracing. There is actually no single response from the regional body at all following the adoption of the digital contact tracing approach. We actually think that what this region need is a personal data protection regulation at the regional level. The one that is robust enough, that is equivalent to the best practice like the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, so we call it the GDPR. Such regulation would set up like a standard in terms of how personal data should be treated across the region, including those that are in the hands of the government. The regulation, if it's done well, if it's robust enough, it would lead to a setup of necessary mechanism to hold the government and stakeholder accountable as well. Less chance for surveillance as well in that case, which is really important. However, this is something that it seems to be so out of reach because it's Southeast Asia at the moment. Yeah, given the political environment in Southeast Asia, it seems to be so hard, so challenging to make it possible. So we come to the conclusion. Digital contact tracing is not something that we can say that it's entirely evil. In the narrative of this region, it's that the app has been rolled out and encouraged to use without any guarantee that the data collected will be safe and not be used for other purposes apart from public health. There's actually like no guarantee at all, and it's really hard to trust whether like will be safe given the technical vulnerability found in this app, lack of transparency, and poor regulation. Hard to trust the government as well, given the political environment. So yes, we see that the adoption of contact tracing in Southeast Asia is based on the perception that public health is more important than personal data and privacy protection. This perception, we concern that is quite dangerous, as it's implied that you have to do it for the safety of the community give up your personal data for this. And we know that the right to privacy is human right. The existing narrative shouldn't be this way. And we really think that the government should do better than this. But Southeast Asia is Southeast Asia. Human right is always overlooked. But we hope that the narrative might change one day. So yes, anyway, that's the end of the presentation. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. So next, let me introduce you to our panelists, as we are going to have a fireside chat later. So Irene Patandro, a senior researcher from the Citizen Lab, and Hong Phúc Dang from a founder of FOSSASIA. The Citizen Lab has looked at some app in the region, and we are really happy that Irene will be sharing this with us today. And Hong Phúc is an open source advocate, and she has an experience working on this issue for over a decade. By the way, if you haven't already known FOSS in terms of like FOSS, in terms, is a term that is stand for free open source software. Free in terms of like freedom, not free in terms of pricing. Yeah, so Hong Phúc and Irene, anyway, I'm glad that you are here. So I'll let Hong Phúc to start first. We'll ask her some questions before I'll let Irene talk, because she has some presentation to show us. So Hong Phúc, based on the finding presented earlier, as we found that some of the digital contact tracing app or platform do not have their source code releases at all. And we don't believe that the intention of the government in terms of releasing the source code follow the logic behind the open technology. But can we argue this, how important it is to make a government project that is dealing with mass data of people to be open source? And what are the benefits of an open source software?
Okay, yeah. So thank you very much for having me here today, Lloyd. And congratulations on this presentation. I see that a lot of work has been done into look into different tracing app in the region. So thank you very much for sharing the information with the community. To answer to your question, right? How important it is to make an government project open source. That's what I understand. And what are the benefits of open source software? To answer to this, I just want to bring up one point. It's in your presentation, right? You see there's a number of countries in Southeast Asia, and apparently each country have developed their own tracing app. They try to fix the same problem, but so many resources and investment have been put in to build similar solution across different countries within our region of Southeast Asia. So the first point is, would it be better for us to use open source to push for the usability? So the money of the citizen like ours will be spent in a more effective and efficient way. People don't have all to start from scratch by building something new. They can share the solution and work across different nations. It also better in terms of the use of resources. And another thing why is it important, I think that not only about a project that handle mass data in the app, but also in general, as an open source advocate, I believe that tooling and solution offered by the government should be always open source, right? It's difficult to achieve, but for many years we have been advocate for this. First of all, it's about the usability, and then you mentioned a lot about security issue, right? So I'm not going to say that open source is more secure than a closed source software, because there's of course a lot of criteria to base into this. But as an open source software, the source code is shared, it means that the way how the software developed being transparent to the community, we have more eyes look into the source code of the project. As you know that you did research, look into different solution, and you make this research to raise awareness of what is behind certain projects. So having something open source is mean that raise the transparency into the source code, and also it's a chance for more research, more developers in the community to contribute and emphasize what are the errors or the vulnerabilities in the project. So that is the second aspect. Another thing that I want to say on the benefits of open source. Um, uh, we have to like the open source exist because of the power of community. I want to say again, you know, big open source project like Linux or uh, Wikipedia, like let's say for example, many people contribute to a project and we become very successful. So it always good, better for people to work together in a more collaborative way. And if we have more eyes in one project, it also enhance the reliability of a certain project, right? So that is my take into this, and I think that I answer both of your question on the government. There is maybe I also want to point out there is an initiative by the Free Software Foundation Europe, public public money, public court, right? So in this initiative, they try to get the governments around Europe to mandate open source solutions. So basically, any legislation software that developed by the government should always be free and open source, so that the citizen have the right, the access into the software and can analyze, evaluate, and understand what's going on behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really useful. Um, like, do you think how an open source software can actually license like a degree of surveillance and enhance like digital security?
Could you say it again, please?
How an open source software can lessen a chance of surveillance and enhance digital security?
Yes, so as I mentioned already, so whether the software is open source or closed source, right, the security issue is always there. And the thing is, for open source, as you see that the source code open, so you have more people, more eyes looking into the source code. It also means that if the government release something or even a company release a project open source, it means that they should be aware that the people from the internet will look into it, also like put more pressure on them to do it right, yeah, to do it right. And why is it more secure? The security is about the review effort of the entire community, and we have experts like your group, or I think that I see in the audience, he also a friend of mine from Singapore, who is actually a security expert, Roland Turner, right? So he did a very long interview and looked deep into trades together in Singapore. I think that he published a very good article. I will share the link later. So because of open source, so experts like Roland and also other from the community have a chance to look into what is behind the software, and also can give their feedback for further improvement or development of the software. Yeah.
And
And
what is, sorry.
yes, surveillance, surveillance issue, right? So I just want to mention that when we talk about open source, it's not only about the software. So the idea of open source is the collaboration model. And if you look into the topic, so I think the most powerful angle of open source is the share of knowledge within the community and in the network. So when people get involved and when people learn about the open source, they actually aware of what's going on, and there is an opportunity for them to dig deeper into a topic. As you said, right, even though security, privacy issue is always there in Asia, in our region, but how many people actually look into this matter? People, the government also said that, so we care about your health in order to put your safety in first, you should use the solution. That is how many people out there actually concerned about the privacy issues, as you discussed here, right? But having people to engage and share more knowledge and exchange collaboratives, we believe that the awareness will raise, and people also know better how to protect themselves and have to behave and interact with different solutions. Yeah.
Can I ask you one thing? Is the license important? What if the source code is released without a license?
Well, license is important because if you see something available on the internet, doesn't mean that you can use it. For instance, you find a piece of code on GitHub without any license, it doesn't guarantee the way how you can use and distribute a project, right? Or the source code. So the license basically runs the use and distribution of a copyrighted work. Yeah, so it's important that a software, a project, if it's the project claim that it is open source, it must have an open source initiative approved license attached into it, right? Because in the license, it gives the user the right to use, to distribute, and also it depends on the license. There are certain obligations that the user need to follow. So it's really important that a project to be considered as open source, it must have an open source initiative approved license. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Hong Fuk. Irene, it's your turn now. So I know you have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you so much.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so I just want to ask you two questions. So based on the work of the Citizen Lab, I know that I know that Southeast Asia, we know that the Citizen Lab has been working on technical analysis of some app in the region in Southeast Asia, and what contact tracing apps or platform have you guys looked at, and what are your concerns based on what you have found so far? And the second question is, based on the work of the Citizen Lab, I know that Southeast Asia has also has record in terms of the use of surveillance technology. Do you think that the flaws that we have found so far in the adoption of digital contact tracing in this region can add up to threat of digital security, particularly of like those who are like the critic to the regime? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kunploy, for inviting me. It's great to be a part of this event, and congratulations on the launch of the project. Digital Reach has been doing great work, and it's a really pleasure to be part of this event today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen where you will see the slides. I don't know why it didn't start at the beginning. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I'm originally from Indonesia, and it's about almost 9 a.m. here in Toronto, and it's snowing. So I'm going to start my presentation today by talking about to answer the questions that Kunploy posed to me. So there are two in particular. So the first one is to outline Citizen Lab investigations into COVID Kaya apps and platforms, as well as our concerns. So the first that I should point out is that we've looked at 3 apps in particular so far. So, and these are apps that do more than just contact tracing. So we've looked at 2 apps in the Philippines. We've looked at COVID Kaya and Stay Safe, and we've looked at 1 app in Indonesia called Peduli Lindungi. And in my presentation, I will describe the concerns over these technology facilitated efforts against COVID-19 in Southeast Asia and its impact on digital security. So the first one is that, as I mentioned, we are looking into various COVID-19 apps in Southeast Asia, and these apps have functionalities that go beyond contact tracing. And so why is the Citizen Lab concerned with COVID-19 apps? And this is because the security and privacy of popular applications have long been a major research focus of the Citizen Lab. And I provided the link here should you want to read our previous research on the subject. And we are concerned with Southeast Asia, not only because I'm Indonesian, although that helps, but also because we are concerned with reports, media reports in particular, and also by civil society groups like Digital Reach over the collection of personal data through government launched apps. And also we've heard of previous incidents of COVID-19 related data breaches in Indonesia and the Philippines, as shared by Kun Ploy earlier. And in particular, we are analyzing, or we have analyzed so far, as I mentioned, the 3 apps, so COVID Kaya and Stay Safe in the Philippines and Peduli Lindungi in Indonesia. So I'll start by giving just a brief overview of COVID Kaya. So this is an app that is used by frontline healthcare workers working in local government units, hospitals, and laboratories to submit and view COVID-19 cases. So this app is not for general use. It seems to be meant more for healthcare workers. It was developed by the Philippines Department of Health together with WHO Philippines, World Health Organization Philippines, and Duer Technologies, which is a tech company with offices in Switzerland and India, in coordination with the Philippine Department of Information and Communications Technology, or DICT. And it is accessible from the web, but it also has an Android and iOS apps version. And in our research, we examined the web and Android versions only. We did not examine the iOS version because, as Kun Ploy mentioned earlier, to do a reverse engineering is very time consuming. And so we really only had the resources to analyze these 2 versions of the app. And what we found is that, first of all, in the web version of the app, we found what is called an authentication logic vulnerability. So even though, as you see in the screenshot here, you need a username and password to log into COVID Kaya, when we tried entering an invalid username or password, because obviously we don't have a username or password, we're not a frontline healthcare worker in the Philippines. And nonetheless, the web app granted us, without notification, access to its application programming interface, or API endpoints and tools that should normally be unavailable to users who are not logged in, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose of putting username and password. And in fact, we were logged in as a super user, meaning we have full view of everything, with name do not delete, and the email address was at qualis.com that was provided, and it allowed us access to the names and locations of healthcare centers, as well as names of over 30,000 healthcare providers who are using the app. However, we did not confirm that this vulnerability could be leveraged to cause the app to reveal sensitive patient data. And then secondly, we looked at the, we then looked at the Android app, and we found vulnerabilities as well. And similarly, using the same username, do not delete, and the password do not delete at 123, we were successfully logged into the dashboard as a super user. And again, it revealed the full names of all healthcare providers and the names of all healthcare centers associated with COVID Kaya. But once again, we did not confirm that this could be used to reveal sensitive patient data. So obviously, I'm not a technical person, I'm a political scientist, but if you're interested in reading the full breakdown of how we did the technical analysis of the web and Android version of the app, I provided the link to the report up in the slide, and also you can visit our website, citizenlab.ca, to read it in full. And so just to illustrate, this is what the dashboard looks like, which shows healthcare providers affiliated with the COVID Kaya app. And as I mentioned, we have analyzed 2 other apps, Peduli Lindungi in Indonesia and Stay Safe. We have a forthcoming report on the subject. We hope to release it next month. And so just briefly about Peduli Lindungi. So it's a contact tracing app, or at least initially it was a contact tracing app. It was launched at the end of March 2020 by the Indonesian Ministry of Communication and Information Technology, together with the Ministry of State-Owned Enterprises. And the purpose is to track exposure to COVID-19. It uses Bluetooth functionality, similar to Google's exposure notification system. However, it is concerning the fact that Peduli Lindungi, like many other apps, as Kun Ploy indicated in Southeast Asia, it does not have a privacy policy. And also briefly about Stay Safe, it's a Philippine government launched contact tracing app. It was developed by Multisys Technologies Corporation, which is a Philippine software engineering company. The upside, I guess, of Stay Safe is that it has a privacy notice, unlike the other apps that we've analyzed, COVID Kaya and Peduli Lindungi. So I'll just preview the report a bit because, as I said, it's forthcoming, so I can't divulge too much at this point. However, we are primarily concerned with evaluating the permissions declared by the Android version of each app, so not the iOS version, the Android version of each app, so Peduli Lindungi, Stay Safe, and also COVID Kaya, it will be contained in that report as well, particularly what Google calls dangerous permissions. So dangerous permissions are permissions that could potentially affect the user's privacy or the device's normal operation. So this includes permission to access your photos, your camera, your location, your contacts, your calendar, your phone status, etc. And we think that it's important to look at these permissions because the Android operating system actually regulates apps' access to sensitive system functionalities based on permissions an app has been that has been granted. And so just to finalize my presentation, obviously there have been concerns of efficacy of using a digital contact tracing app versus manual contact tracing. There are pros and cons of both approaches, obviously. But also, I think the larger concern here is that, in many of these apps, we're seeing what can be called as mission creep, right? So to give one example, by mission creep, I mean the purpose of the app keeps expanding. So if we look at Peduli Lindungi, the government launched contact tracing app in Indonesia, as I said, it originally began as a contact tracing app. However, since the app has been launched, it also now includes a geolocation feature to alert users if they are in areas called red zones. So red zones are areas where there are probable or suspected or confirmed COVID-19 cases. So obviously it requests for your location access. And now I believe in July, I think they released a digital diary feature, meaning that it will track where you've been every time you scan a QR code. And they've also added a facial recognition feature that tests that I think be able to look at your face and see whether you have a mask on before you enter a public area or a designated area, and also check your temperature, right? So as the app's purpose keeps increasing, the fear is that it collects even more data, right? And then the fact as well is that in many of these jurisdictions, there is no expiry date as to when the data that has been collected, once the pandemic is over, when will it be deleted, right? And then with this mission creep, with this growing functionalities of the apps, obviously the number of permissions that are required are going to increase. And in some cases, we've seen that they've requested unnecessary permissions for the app to function. And as a result, instead of data minimization, which is a principle that has been advocated by the WHO, as well as many other civil society organizations, and that is to minimize the amount of data collected so that if a data breach occur, because no system is perfect, right? Even if you have privacy protections in place, so that if a data breach occur, you minimize the negative impact to users, right? Because there wasn't much data or personally identifiable information that was collected in the first place. And I'll give one example for Stay Safe, right? Like for Stay Safe launch in the Philippines, you could actually log in using your Facebook account, which means that the developer could potentially associate information collected by the app, such as your location or COVID-19 status, with your online identity, such as your Facebook account or email address. And then as Hong Fook and Sutawan has mentioned, there are just generally concerns over lack of privacy protections and enforcement, as Chike mentioned in the chat, right? And the fact that, when we looked at these apps, there were no privacy policy for Peduli Lindungi and COVID Kaya. So the implication is that we just have to trust the government at their word when they say that, oh, yes, don't worry, we are protecting your privacy. Especially as Damar also pointed out in the chat, Indonesia does not yet have a personal data protection policy. So the fact that the government and other actors in Indonesia, but also elsewhere in the region, are launching these apps without adequate privacy protections, without making the code open source, as Hong Fook said, so that us as researchers, we can take a look at what's going on behind the scenes. It makes it very risky, I think, and it's also very challenging for us as researchers to to investigate what are the potential privacy implications of these apps and security implications as well. So I will end my presentation there. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks.
Thank you, Irene. That's a very useful presentation. So yeah, thank you so much. It's really nice to have both you and Hong Fook here. The reason that we have both of you join the event is because we believe that your experience and knowledge can help elaborate the finding, and we have learned great information from you. So thank you very much. So next, let's do the Q&A. We have 35 minutes here for the Q&A. So we have 8 questions, 8 Q&A here. First is from Roland Turner. To be clear, is it your position that privacy is more important than public health? That it's so important and widespread that, as in the US, is an acceptable price to pay? Okay, I would say that there should be a balance. Like I said before, that using digital contact tracing is not like entirely evil, but if you want to collect like a mass data of people, you have to provide like some kind of guarantee that the data that is collected will be kept safely and will not be misused for stolen or exploited, or like having a risk of being in a data breach incident, things like that. Yeah, and actually we haven't found information, like solid information yet about like how effective of digital contact tracing since the adoptions of it, like in terms of how many cluster or individual it's been detected. So like in order to put, like Thailand, we have quite a low number of cases right now, and it's not because of digital contact tracing approach. It's something else, like strict rules, like social distancing, things like that. It's kind of like everything all together, not just like digital contact tracing. So yeah, so that's the answer. Do you have anything to add, Irene and Hong Fook, on this question?
Yeah, so I think that is a very valid point, so what is the boundary, whether people care more about the privacy or the public health, but as far as I understand, so the Trace Together app of Singapore, and normally people will record the data of people have positive with the tests of COVID, not that they will collect the data of everyone in the country, as I understand, right? So maybe Gloy, you can explain, or do the people collect the data of everyone? So right now it's still not a mandatory that everyone must install the app. I understand that it's still voluntarily, it's optional to the people.
It is still optional, but then it will become mandatory at the end of December, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. Yep. Irene, you have something to say for this question?
No, I think you answered it beautifully. I mean, I agree with you that it is a balance. It's definitely not one or the other, right? I think that the fear is that, as we've seen in many governments, not just in Southeast Asia, but also elsewhere, the fact that the pandemic is then used as a justification to violate rights, and not just privacy rights, right, but also freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and other rights. So I think it's important to ensure that we don't end up in a situation where the pandemic ends, but then we have a human rights crisis in our hands because of what the government has been able to do, has been able to accomplish during the pandemic itself. So.
So next question from Jazz. Has there been any instance where the government tries to exempt this technology from privacy regulation because they respond to a health crisis emergency? I think that from what I know, not that I've known of yet. Yeah, not that I've known of yet. I think it's because it's like in some country, even though like it's there, but it's like, sorry, okay. It's like, actually, if the effectiveness of digital contact tracing is actually still in question. It's like, it hasn't been, like I said in the earlier question, it hasn't been any like solid evidence yet, like how many cluster or how like it actually detects, or it's like able to gather information about it. And that's why it's like we haven't found any evidence yet that, okay, like this, the data collected is used, and the government is not like, the data is used, and the government try to exempt the data collected for something else, things like that. Yeah, so we haven't found any public information about that yet. Next question, what is the end goal of this project? Will Digital Reach sending a recommendation report to the ASEAN government? We will keep monitoring it, and because I think, personally, I think that there will be more developments coming in, and then we'll keep adding the information into the database. We don't know what is going to happen when the situation is less, how do you say it? When the situation is better, like what's going to happen to this kind of contact tracing? What is going to happen to the data collected? So we'll have to see how the situation unfold and what happened to them, and then we'll think about like what we going to do about it, whether in terms of like advocacy things, advocacy activities. Next, from how many days earlier to victim report contact tracing is done, as victim might have transmitted before she knows report. Irene, do you have the information about this? I think it depends, actually.
Yeah, I think it depends. Roland might know the answer to this, but I think for Trace Together, I think it records it in your phone encrypted for the past 25 days. So the contact that you've had for the past 25 days. And then I think in some cases, so if let's say you are confirmed to have COVID-19, then the authorities will do contact tracing to see who you've been in contact with for the past 14 days. So I think that's how it works, but I'm not sure if that's uniform across all apps. Probably not.
Yeah, I agree. So next question is from Jess as well. So which regional body should come up with the regional data protection regulation, if ever? I think ASEAN should initiate it, but we know about the situation. Yeah, like I think that so a few years ago or a year ago, they actually have data protection, like a statement. I can't remember what year that this statement or this I don't know how they call it has been passed, but it's not legally binding. And it has exception as well, like it doesn't include government, things like that. So in order to have things like GDPR in this region is really complicated. It's something, so like I said before earlier in my presentation, it's kind of, have to say, impossibly out of reach given the political environment that is repressive. We see the rise of the surveillance law in the region as well. So it would be hard to, it would be political for the ASEAN Secretariat to persuade all the ASEAN country leaders to adopt such thing. Yeah. And yeah, because it wouldn't give them freedom to be authoritarian, I think. Yeah, so this is something that is really hard, and I just don't know what the future will be in this case. Do you have anything to add, Irene and Hongfuk, for this one?
Yeah, so I think that of course, you said that it's not easy to have a change in the region, right? But I thought that instead of talking about the regional policy as a whole, if one of the countries, I don't know which country in Southeast Asia would be the role model, would lead up this initiative. So normally we see in the region that if one country doing this thing, then there will be the followers afterward. So it really depends on the people we have. I see that we have quite a number of participants here. I'm sure that there was also people who work with a government or NGO, but if there's your government, if there is any chance from one of the governments in the region, I think that if we like whatever we can contribute, push this topic forward, and then if we manage to make one country doing something about around like introduce a policy, I believe that there is a higher chance that the region could also follow. So if so that what I want to say. So instead of thinking of okay, one big policy everyone follow, if we have managed to get at least one or two country to introduce a policy, there is a higher chance to get buy-in.
Yeah, I mean, excellent points by Hong Fook and Kun Sutawan. I do agree that I think to establish a regional mechanism would be very difficult because the level of development, in terms of, for instance, internet penetration or smartphone penetration varies widely between countries in Southeast Asia. So to get an agreement on what, privacy rights should look like, I think would be challenging. And, like even when we talk about privacy enforcement in each individual countries that already have Privacy Act, I mean, that's still challenging, right? Again, Chike pointed out earlier in the Philippines, it's still challenging to even enforce it there. The fact that the Privacy Commission only can recommend to the Department of Justice if there have been violations. The Privacy Commission doesn't have its own ability to prosecute cases, right? It would certainly make it difficult. And I believe in Singapore and Malaysia, I think their Privacy Act do not even apply to government. It only applies to private sector actors, right? And Indonesia's draft personal data protection law, it's currently being debated in Parliament. Of course, there's going to be negotiations among political parties on what the law should entail. And although in the Indonesian draft, the personal data protection law is to apply to both government and private sector actors. However, in the draft, there are so many exceptions to the rule. So related to Jessameen's question earlier, are there exceptions? I'm almost certain that at the end of the day, the Indonesian personal data protection law would have an exception for this kind of circumstance where there's a global pandemic and the government needs to collect data, and therefore they are accepted from having to abide by the privacy regulation, right? So given these challenges, I think it's going to be very difficult to come up with like a regional mechanism because in the country level, there are still so many flaws, there's still so many work to do. So yeah, I think it's going to be challenging.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Hong Fook. I think we have a question from Shige. Yeah, Shige, is there information or research around the potential for watering hole attacks on the website where these QR codes lead to? Do you have any answer?
Me? No, well, we haven't looked at that, but thank you, Chike, for the question. I'll pass it on to my colleagues to see if there's anything there that we can find.
Okay. Next, from Joseph, are there any regional example of enforcement of mandates? Mandates use of either DCT or QR codes. Has this been litigated in the region? Not that I know of, actually. Do you know, Irene?
No, I don't know. I don't think that the use of digital contact tracing or QR codes have been mandatory in the region. So no. However, in other jurisdictions where they have made it mandatory, so for instance, India, right? With the Arokya Set 2 digital contact tracing app, it is mandatory for civil servants, so people who work with government, and I believe for people who work as food delivery. So if you work for Uber Eats or Grab and you deliver food, I think you have to install that. But that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. There might have been litigation there, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, how can Southeast Asian government enable balance between the surveillance and controlling lockdown? How can Southeast Asia government enable balance between the surveillance and controlling lockdown? Well, I think that, well, actually, it's like, balance between surveillance and controlling lockdown. I think that it's two different things. Controlling lockdown is necessary, but where is it? Controlling lockdown is necessary, in country where the pandemic is really serious. Balance between the surveillance. The thing is, contact tracing will be really useful. Digital contact tracing will be really useful. Will be more useful in terms of when the lockdown is loosened. Yeah, because people start to come out of the house, people start to come out of the residence, going shopping, things like that, and that's where it can come into play. But then, like I said before, in order to use digital contact tracing, the government has to make sure that the collected data is collected safely and we proceeded safely according to concerning the right to privacy, things like that. And it's the thing that we have found is they try to encourage people to use it without making any guarantee that this information is going to be safe, things like that. So this is why it is a problem. Yeah. Anything from Irene and Hongfuk on this?
Hongfuk, go ahead. Do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think that Chloe also mentioned and in her research point out three big problems. And then if you want the government to do something, if you are from the government and have a chance to change something, maybe the government should start to address the problem mentioned in that research. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'll just add a little bit here. This is a really important question, and I think if we know the answer, we wouldn't be here today. Maybe you and I would have no job, Kun Ploy. right? I think that yeah, this is a big challenge, and I think will continue to be a challenge as more and more of these apps are launched with more features. As Ian Chong pointed out in the chat, you know, there are fears that Trace Together in Singapore will be even more intrusive. It will be made mandatory, etc. Right? And also, you know, we've covered a couple of apps in this conversation so far, but obviously there are others that have been launched by other governments. So Yatanar is here. She works with the Myanmar ICT Development Organization, and they have also looked at a couple of apps in Myanmar. They looked at 4 in particular, and then with similar issues, right? No data retention policy, no information about personally identifiable information that will be collected, and intrusive permission requests. So obviously, this question of balancing surveillance and lockdown, I think, is not just true for Indonesia, the Philippines, or Southeast Asia, but also the rest of the world. And I think, so how to balance it? I mean, if I was to try and answer the question, I think it would be for governments when they are implementing these methods, whether digital or analog, I think they need to be as transparent as possible, and there needs to be clear accountability mechanisms. A lot of civil society organizations have written about how to make digital contact tracing less intrusive. Organizations like the UN have issued guidelines on how to minimize the impact to human rights while governments are responding to COVID-19. So for instance, by ensuring that responses are both necessary and proportionate, and again, transparent and accountable, right? So that includes, as I mentioned before in my presentation, that there needs to be a sunset clause. There needs to be an expiry date as to when these apps will stop collecting data, and when the data that has been collected will then be destroyed because the pandemic is now over, right? So I think we need these safeguards to ensure that human rights are not just, you know, violated in the name of responding to the pandemic, which because we know, right, from looking at other examples. So for instance, if we look at the Citizen Lab has done research, and many others have done research looking at what is called event-based information control. So usually during the time of a major event, so a pandemic is certainly a major event, but there are other major events, right? Like the Olympics, the World Cup, right? Any major sporting events. Usually they are used as a justification for governments to pass new security legislation, to install more CCTV cameras. So research by Coding Rights in Brazil had found that I think the city of Rio de Janeiro, because they hosted the Olympics and the World Cup, increased the number of CCTV cameras from, I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like from 1,500 to 3,000 CCTV cameras installed in the country, in the city, sorry. And then of course, what ended up happening was the Olympics was over, the World Cup was over, but the CCTV cameras remain, right? We know that it is much easier to institute new security measures in the name of protecting something like a major event, whether that's a sporting event or a pandemic, but it's much more difficult to remove them once the crisis event or the sporting event is over, right? And so we need to ensure that this does not happen, that governments don't just amp up their security measures in the name of confronting a pandemic, but then these efforts remain and our rights are then violated because of issues, as Ploy pointed out, a lack of rule of law, lack of democratic institutions, lack of safeguards or oversight after the pandemic is over. So I think, yeah, we need to continue vigilant and to continue to demand accountability from our governments.
Okay, I think well, thank you, Irene. Sorry. Okay, so we have last question from Diane. As we haven't mapped out the project end goal yet, given this finding, any ideas on how civil society push back now? Well, actually, I have like asking some civil society organization that we partner. Actually, earlier, I think in July, we launched we actually sent 2 open letters to 2 governments, the government of the Philippines and also the government of Indonesia, actually, to be more transparent about their contact tracing effort. We asked them to release the source code, for example, and doing other things like issue a specific regulation to make the situation be more transparent, to know that where the data is proceeded, things like that, what kind of like the architecture, whether how it works, because it's really it was not much information about how it works at all, whether like data, for example, like whether the data is encrypted, what kind of encryption approach they use, things like that. So at the end of it, we haven't gotten any thing back from them, which is actually quite common for like in terms of like when the government receive some kind of open letter, some kinds of like some kind of demand or something like that from the civil society, they usually chose to remain silent and not respond anything about it. I don't know, actually, like we might, as the situation goes, we might have come up with something that we can think of that is more effective in terms of like advocacy and community pushback, but we have to think more about it, what we can do. The situation changed quite fast. Like for example, like in Vietnam, first they were using like fixed ID in order to track in the contact tracing in order to make it work. But then the fixed ID is actually relatively really easy compared to the temporary ID. And later in the second version, after the second wave of the pandemic that they started in Da Nang, suddenly they changed it to temporary ID. And like all the recommendation that we have, like I was in the middle of like writing the paper at that time, and we have to change the recommendation immediately. So we have to be careful on this about like the action from the civil society as well, because sometimes the situation go quite fast, and this kind of thing is quite new, and it involves some technical thing as well. So like we also need some time to understand it as well, to put things into picture. Yeah. Irene, Hong Phúc, any things to add on this?
No, thank you.
No, as well. Thank you.
Okay, from Dave, how much public awareness of COVID app surveillance is there? Will it take a whistleblower at a government agency to get people to notice? How much public awareness of COVID app surveillance is there? I think it depends on country as well. Like I think like in Vietnam, we have, as we monitor the situation, when the app first rolled out, when Blue Zone was rolled out, there was like a very few number of users. And as the second wave of the pandemic that started in Da Nang happened, if I'm not wrong, I can't remember the exact number. After the second wave, the government started aggressively promote the use of Blue Zone, and within a month, the number of users rose from, I think it's about 200,000 people from the entire country to like 20 million or something. So it's like, in this case, it's like some people, some source say that people are concerned of their privacy. That's why they don't want to use the app. But I think that in this case, it depends on country as well. I think some people, it's because they don't have the phone that work that is applicable with the contact tracing as well. So sometimes it's like sometimes they just don't want to use it because they just cannot afford it because the mobile phone doesn't work on it. Some limitation as well. There might just be groups of like children, senior people, things like that. So I think it depends on the country. Some people, when they are pushed to use they use it. Some people, they concerned about their own privacy and choose not to use it. So it depends on the public awareness. No, it depends on the digital knowledge, digital literacy as well of some country. Will it take a whistleblower at the government agency to get people to notice? I don't know. I don't know. I just don't think that I can answer this question. Whistleblower at the government agency. There might be some people who know who are inside of the government agency, or there might be some people who are like part of the development team that want to expose, but it's something that it's really hard to know in terms of this. Yeah. Anything to add, Hong Fook and Irene?
No, I mean, I think that's a very good question. It might just take a whistleblower, right? Because in some cases, they make it very difficult for researchers to reverse engineer the app. I'll give an example. So COVID Kaya, when we did our investigation into COVID Kaya, it was a bit difficult to find out who exactly developed COVID Kaya. I think we found Dur Technologies listed, I think in the App Store. But you know, when I reviewed press releases issued by the government of the Philippines and media reports, Dur Technologies was not mentioned at all, at least in the articles that I read. And so, and the email address for Dur Technologies as a developer of COVID Kaya was just a generic email address, like info at something, I can't remember what it was, but it was like a generic email address. And so I think in terms of launching these apps, I think governments need to be, once again, like very transparent and accountable in doing so. They need to make it clear who developed the apps. And so if there are concerns over privacy and security, if we find vulnerabilities, it would make it very easy for us to then, you know, reach out to the developer because we know who they are, right? And I think in the absence of this, it might just take a whistleblower, right? Because otherwise it's very difficult as researchers, even for my colleagues who have the technical know-how to do so. And in terms of awareness of, you know, the privacy and security issues with these COVID-19 apps, I think, and there are civil society colleagues here in the chat, and so feel free to chime in, but I think it is really challenging to get sustained attention from people on a topic, right? Like if there's a big data breach, then people might, oh yeah, you know, privacy, that's the thing. We need to care about privacy because I might be impacted. But then, you know, some weeks would have passed and there are other news and people's lives are, you know, they're busy with other things. It is very difficult to keep privacy and security at the top of people's minds. And maybe it's because we have these devices all the time with us, right? Like we don't even think twice about, you know, the potential impact of installing this app or that app, and not just COVID-19 apps, but other apps as well. And so I think, you know, my civil society colleagues here have a lot of work to do and have a big role to play in ensuring, you know, to continue to do awareness raising efforts so that these issues are at the forefront of people's minds.
Okay, thank you so much. We have come to the end of the launch event actually, and thank you so much everybody for joining. Really appreciate it. I hope that you get to learn new information. So for those who would like to contact the organization later, like press would like to contact later, you can, let me type it. You can contact in this email. And we'll be happy to respond to your email. And after you leave, there'll be a short survey for you to fill in. Your feedback would be so valuable to us because we'll have to learn, we will get to learn how to improve our event next time as we host it. In the coming months, we are going to launch the 2020 annual report on digital rights in Southeast Asia. So should be at the beginning of next year, actually. If you would like to be notified about the event, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And thank you again. Thank you so much for tonight. Please stay safe and hope to see you later. Bye.